and on Zoom. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, no mai, haere mai, ki te hui mariko o te Haumi Tawhiro. So welcome to this online seminar about sustainable investing. This is our 25th, I think, weekly seminar, might be 26th. You can see the others on our website, on Mindful Money, including over the past few weeks, we've had Matt Winneray from the NZ Super Funds, our Climate Minister, James Shaw, an interesting panel on a gender approach to investing. And last week we had Māori perspectives on investing. So a fair bit of variety. So again, please check those seminars out on our website. And while you're at it, you can have a look and see what's in your KiwiSaver fund or your investment fund. Tonight, we're talking about investing and the environment. We'll have a discussion for about 20 minutes and then we'll open up for questions. Please use the Zoom chat or the comments section on Facebook Live to ask any questions. And you can do that at any stage as we talk. So it's my great pleasure tonight to invite our honoured guests, and I'm really looking forward to this. High quality speakers. We have Kevin Haig, who needs a little introduction, I'm sure. He's Chief Executive of Forest and Bird, and was once upon a time a Green Party MP, and has worked in district health boards and done lots of other stuff before that. And he's a West Coaster, so joining us from Westport, Greymouth. Right?
Yeah. Actually, Wellington tonight.
Okay. And also joined by John Berry. John's the CEO of Pathfinder and CareSaver. And they are a very ethical investment provider. You can see their funds featured on Mindful Money website, and John's been involved in the investment world for many years, including working for Deutsche Bank and others. He's involved in charities on men's health and many other issues, and was involved in the government's code working group about a code of conduct on financial advice. So warm welcome, John. Welcome back even to a Mindful Money seminar.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So tonight we're going to talk about investing in the environment. And I'm going to start with asking Kevin really to lay out the territory for us, because I think for many people, you know about the climate crisis. We just don't hear enough about the environmental crisis that has so many different dimensions. So Kevin, can you just give us a snapshot of some of the things that are really at a crisis point and that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, well, kia ora, Barry. Kia ora, everyone. It's great to join you this evening, and congratulations to Mindful Money for this series. That's an impressive record, Barry, and you should be proud of that. Forest and Bird is engaged in conservation and environmental protection right across the spectrum. So it's not just forests and birds, it's fish and invertebrates and all sorts of other things. We work across terrestrial conservation, marine, freshwater, climate change, and we've just added, in fact, economic transformation to our strategic plan. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. As you say, we probably are more used to a conversation about the climate crisis, especially in the the last few years. But some of you may have seen that cartoon that was doing the rounds during COVID of a series of waves about to engulf us. It started with COVID, and then it talked about recession, and then the next one was climate crisis, and the biggest wave of all, towering above them all, was biodiversity collapse. And it's so crucial because human beings are animals. We are parts of ecosystems as well. So when ecosystems start to collapse, that affects us. And, as every probably third form science student knows, actually, if you start taking species out of ecosystems, they become weaker and weaker, and everything's connected to everything else. So this is actually an existential problem
Kevin, you're just breaking up a little bit.
for us. And I know about, for example, the UN report last year that talked about 1 million species threatened with extinction around the world. Well, in all the world's treasure troves of biodiversity, we're the country in the world with the highest proportion of endemic species of any in the world. But we're also the country in the world with the highest proportion of our endemic species at risk of or threatened with extinction. So this amazing treasure trove for the world is actually also the hottest spot in the world for the biodiversity crisis. And that's across all of our ecosystems. There are several reasons, and I won't go into the whole list for why that collapse is occurring. But the two biggest ones are, first of all, there's invasive alien species, so other species that we've brought here that are causing devastation, because, of course, one of the reasons that we have this richness of biodiversity is that we're at the ends of the earth, we're on islands, we're the last place in the world to have human occupation. So that's led to that extraordinary diversity. And that's why it's at particular risk from invasive alien species. But the other really big factor has been habitat destruction or degradation. And I guess probably most people can think, even in our own lifetimes, of lowland forest being lost. And that's certainly one of the ecosystems, one of the habitats that's been lost. We've talked quite a bit about wetland destruction. We've lost 90% of our wetlands. We continue to lose them. But it's actually not just those ones. Of the, I think it's 15 habitat types that Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research monitors and measures, 14 of them have continued to decline and be lost over the last 10 years or so. So we lost an awful lot, and we are continuing to lose them. So we are continuing to go backwards. So it's important to understand why that is. And of course, part of it is that we've destroyed some of those habitats for human habitation, but mostly we've destroyed them for commercial reasons. We've made nature available for commercial exploitation. Like me, some of you will have been trained in economics, and you'll remember that first lecture you ever did was around a supply and demand graph, and probably the second lecture you ever had was about the theory of the firm and the circular flow of money in the economy, and that model typically shows nature as raw materials or waste disposal for the firm, for the economic system. And typically those are also shown as without cost. The tragedy of the commons sort of writ large. And so that's what we've done. We've actually made land in economic terms, but in fact all natural systems available as the raw materials for the economy, and also treated the natural world as our waste disposal system, a drain for the economy. And that orientation of having nature serving the economy, I would argue, and have done again and again, is completely wrong. But whether it's a mining company that's pulling wealth out of the earth, or it's a farming company that's draining a wetland, fertilizing a dry land, as we see in the Mackenzie Basin. Whether it's a fishing company that may be overfishing snapper and thereby destroying kelp forest marine ecosystems, the primary driver of biodiversity loss in our country and in fact around the world is in the actions of individual companies or other economic players. And what I say is, that relationship that we have, where the environment, where nature and people actually as well are essentially inputs into the economy, and the economy is treated as if it were the most important set of goals. We've got to turn that on its head. We actually have to say what are the environmental goals and the social goals that we have as a society, both in our country and as a global community. And let's design our economic instruments and arrangements so that they help us achieve those goals. And I guess that's where investment comes in, and certainly as part of Forest and Bird's agenda for the next 5 or so years, and I'm sure it will be longer. We're now very interested in exactly the space that you've been encouraging debate, Barry, of investing to achieve the goals that we need.
Cool.
So maybe that's the point where I should tag to John.
Yeah. Before you do, let me just show one thing that you started off in the graphic on the waves of collapses. And I think it's very nice for those of you who can't see. COVID-19 gets swallowed by a recession, gets swallowed by climate change, and trumping all is biodiversity collapse. And as you said, collapse of ecosystems being an important part of that. So thank you, Kevin. This really kind of laid out the territory, and we have been doing these seminars for a while, and in a way, it's quite possible to forget what's at the end point of stuff that we're talking about in terms of the impact of corporate activity. And I think you've laid it out really, really clearly. Let me pass to John, because then the question comes, so if you're somebody on the call or listening to these the seminar afterwards, and the seminar gets seen by many more people after the event than during, you may be sitting there saying, so what's this got to do with my investment, my KiwiSaver or my investment fund? So John, trace the dots for us, please.
Cool. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Barry, and great intro, Kevin, and I love your work at Forest and Bird. I thought just quickly, I'll just mention one thing that struck me with that cartoon that you showed everyone, is the one, if there's one positive that's come out of COVID-19 in my mind, is that as humans in society, we can actually mobilize resource and change attitude if we need to. And for the biodiversity and the climate change waves that are coming, there is hope that although they're multi-decade and not right in our face right at the moment, we can actually make the changes we need to to improve the world for the future. But look, to answer your question, Barry, what does this have to do with your KiwiSaver? What does it have to do with your savings? It has a lot to do with it. I'm really focused on 3 ways that all of us as Kiwis can change the world. And the first being how you spend your time. The second, how you spend your money. Everyone gets, factory farming, chickens against free range, or spending money on less packaging or public transport. But the thing I'm really focused on, the third thing you can do, so it's how you spend your time, how you spend your money, and how you invest your money. So where you invest your money, particularly in KiwiSaver, which is $60 billion of money that we collectively have as Kiwis, what behaviour do we want to encourage? What do you want to, how do we want to try and shift corporate thinking? And there's several ways you can do that, and several ways that managers and KiwiSaver managers approach it. And the first and most basic is just to avoid stuff, so-called exclusions. And in the environmental space, the obvious one is coal companies, oil companies, anyone contributing to climate change, but it could also be animal testing and worrying about biodiversity and animal welfare. So excluding and avoiding companies, it may help starve them with capital, it may help them realize they need to change, but it ultimately is a difficult way to change the world, because if you avoid stuff, you've still got this pot of money that you're investing with your KiwiSaver or your savings. Where is that money going? And it's the positive lens, where am I going to invest my money is what really matters. And you'll hear, many of you will have heard ESG, environmental, social and governance investing. You're going to hear that expression a lot more in the future. And it's a positive lens to investing, which is the ESG, the E being environment, focusing on companies that manage their resources, reduce their waste, are concerned about their emissions, and manage their risk with the environment. So they avoid, if you think of an oil company that doesn't manage its risk with the environment, you have a Deepwater Horizon spill, $65 billion cost. So positive lens on companies, and also positive lens on what is going to make money long term. So we look for the intersection between what is sustainable for the planet and what is going to make money long term for our investors. And they're things like renewable energy. Renewable energy compared to fossil fuels over the last year has been just a one-way story. Renewable energy is one, hands down. Forestry, data centers, and water. So around water treatment, water purification. So those sort of themes, good for the environment, but also good for investors. So essentially, to answer your question, Barry, what does it have to do for my KiwiSaver? It has a lot to do with it. More and more environmental investing is being regarded as a key metric for selecting companies and selecting investment themes. And it's not just intuitively it sounds good. There's actually plenty of academic research around reducing risk in companies by managing ESG factors.
Yeah, so let's dive into that a little bit, John. So how some of this stuff works. So when you avoid investing in companies, in a way you're taking away your investment from them. And if enough people do that, as is happening with fossil fuels, it raises the cost of capital and kind of in a way delegitimizes the industry. So can you trace through how the engagement process works? If you talked about environment, social governance approaches, you talk more about how this corporate engagement can really lift standards and change companies.
Okay. First thing to note, Barry, is just with companies that are already listed, if I don't invest in them, the shares already exist and they already have the capital. So it's really new debt, new equity being issued that you, as well as the currently issued stuff you want to avoid, that really has the impact. But, engagement, this idea of investors, shareholders, talking to a company, talking to management, talking to the board, and making it really clear what behaviour they want or don't want. From our perspective, there's 2 ways to approach it. One is, should I be engaging with the company at all? Is it a company that can change? Is it a company I want to be engaging with? And if you look at fossil fuel companies, for example, we don't invest in any fossil fuel companies, but if you look at some companies like Z Energy, led by Mike Bennett's, he's a strong believer in climate change, and he recognises they need to change. You know, Z Energy, I think, is 9% of New Zealand's emissions it's responsible for, but it totally recognises the need to shift energy. And even BP, the CEO and chair recently have made statements around how they recognise climate change is not just a threat to BP, but zero emissions or net zero emissions is the right outcome for society. And so they're starting to talk the talk, but you know, can they actually shift their business? And what does history tell us? Well, history tells us, firstly, like BP is a great example. In the 90s, BP, which was British Petroleum, they changed to Beyond Petroleum, in this idea they were going to be a solar and wind company and renewables and change the world. And it was just rhetoric. You know, nothing changed. And 30 years later, we're having the same conversation. And so, in my mind, some of those companies are so big and so embedded to their business model. And I'm not necessarily singling out BP, because it's, you know, companies like Kodak, you know, everyone knows the Kodak story. They developed digital technology, but they never commercialized it because they were wedded to their existing business model. And, you know, what car companies have that issue? What car companies is there no point engaging with, because they will not shift to an EV model and are stuck with a combustion engine. So the first thing is, you know, can their business model actually change? If you think there is point in engaging with a company to change its model or change its behavior, a lot can be achieved through engagement. And we look offshore, really big move there for companies setting ambitious targets, really ambitious targets. Starbucks, for example, you know, we had some engagement with Starbucks, and they recently set goals for 2030. They want to reduce emissions by 50%, and they want to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill by 50%. Microsoft want to be carbon negative by 2030. And that push has come from those really aspirational goals, but scientific goals as well, has come from engagement. And I think, you know, a lot of fund managers and institutional investors have been quite quiet on that front for a number of years, but are starting to realise and be expected to use their power. And, you know, we've seen it recently with, you know, Rio Tinto, how a company, you know, can fundamentally have to change, and its leadership have to change. With Rio Tinto damaging 46,000-year-old indigenous, you know, sites, their CEOs had to step down. And we've seen that in other companies where there's leadership change and there's governance change for unacceptable behaviour, and that's not necessarily public how it comes about, but it's engagement from shareholders. So change is possible, and I think shareholders should be more and more using that power that they have.
Cool, thank you. And you know, I think the example of Rio Tinto is quite instructive for people who may not know. They got into trouble after they knowingly destroyed sites of cultural significance to Aboriginal people in the Pilbara region, and these were 46,000-year-old cave paintings. And Rio Tinto did it in order to save a bit of money and earn slightly higher returns. And it wasn't even a decimal point in terms of the amount of money that they earned over a year, but it was the fact that they knowingly destroyed these sites led to a real furore. And, you know, as we were talking beforehand, this is not new to mining companies. This is the kind of things that has been taking place for some time. And I guess one of the things from our perspective is that those companies that own the shares should do something about these problems before they happen. You know, before the BP Horizon oil disaster, where they were again trying to save a bit of money by taking a shortcut, you know, before the destruction of Aboriginal sites. And that's a kind of responsibility of people who we invest in. And so, you know, I think it's very, very good, John, to kind of put that context, because it's really about corporate governance in a you know, that makes an economic system more accountable, more transparent, and more responsive to investors. Kevin, how do you see this playing out in the the kind of environmental issues that you work on in New Zealand and some of the global things that you see, do you actually kind of believe this stuff, that in fact we're going to be able to persuade these companies through investor pressure, perhaps as well as other pressures, in order to make some of the fundamental changes?
Yeah. I really do think that there's potential, and I guess we can. There's several different ways. I mean, in some cases it's a question of capital, but more often it's investor input into the governance level decisions for companies, creating ethical pressure in some cases. I have to say, when I look across the sectors, I don't see any mining companies that are showing potential. And from an environmental point of view, mining practice is virtually always complete destruction of the environment that they work with. I mean, the Rio Tinto example from Australia is, particularly egregious, but actually their normal practice is entirely destructive of the environments that they're working in. There's an interesting. So a couple of thoughts that cropped up while John was speaking. One was that our own experience, not in investment so much, but in some of our commercial relationships. So for banking, for example, we used to bank with ANZ. We switched our bank accounts after a process of engagement with the banks to KiwiBank. We've continued to talk to KiwiBank. We've said to them that their KiwiSaver product, because it didn't have an absolute rule around fossil fuels, was still problematic for us, and we've seen progress occur. So we've had that experience of engaging with the company and changing its behaviour, and we do that a little bit on the sponsorship side as well. Where we do have some commercial relationships with companies who sponsor us, and we have an ethical screen that we use to determine whether or not we'll take their money. We would never take the money of a mining company, but in some other industries, so there are companies working in the dairy sector, for example, that we would identify as potentially sector leaders whose behaviour is changing the practice of the industry. And the collective yogurt manufacturer is an example of that, where their practice around packaging, for example, and sourcing of the milk that they use to make their yogurts actually is changing the behaviour of the industry. So, I mean, that's I guess a parallel to the kind of engagement that investors can have that John was discussing.
And John, through Pathfinder and more recently CareSaver, you guys have kind of shown some leadership on this stuff in New Zealand. Do you see, and there was the Responsible Investment Association did a report this last week, Mindful Money's done some reports. It shows that the industry is changing, right? That we're seeing the investment sector starting to take these issues on board. Are you optimistic that you're going to be going to have lots of others that are coming down this path and taking the issues much more seriously than they have in the past?
Yeah, look, I'm really optimistic about it, Barry. I think, and for a couple of reasons. One is the the impact that Mindful Money has had and shining a light on what is in people's KiwiSaver is quite enlightening for people and is absolutely changing behaviour from providers. So well done with that. And So I think there's that. I think responsible investment / ethical investment, perhaps for quite a while, was a nice to have, a nice marketing tool, a nice discussion point. But I think managers now get this is actually, there is evidence, plenty of evidence that ESG improves performance and reduces risk in portfolios. So why wouldn't you do it from a financial perspective? But secondly, there's an expectation from Kiwis now around where their money is invested, how their money is invested. There is an expectation, and you've got to walk the walk. You've got to be genuine and authentic if you're a manager of people's money, and you're telling them you're taking ethics into account or managing it responsibly. You've actually got to do that. And I think if I look now compared to when we launched our first ethical fund in 2010, when people literally said, you're mad, no one's going to invest in this, no one's going to want this, we have a tree hugger client who might be interested in it, but no one else is. How far we've come in 10 years, it's absolutely mainstream now, and it's I think it's consistent with Kiwis' values, and I think it's also going to make people more money for their retirement. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
And I think your CareSaver financial performance and other ethical funds that are, kind of right up there in terms of the highest performers in their categories, gives, it sort of explodes the myth that you pay a cost for ethical investing. In fact, the data now shows that on average, ethical investing actually earns very good, if not better, returns than conventional. So certainly you guys are showing that in spades at CareSaver. Kevin, if you look at your work going forward, you've got a lot of instruments that you can pull. You do some advocacy around regulations and lobbying, and you've got members across the country and local groups, and you mobilize consumers on issues around fisheries, for example. So do you see these kind of investor pressure tools or divestment tools as being, essentially part of your, to avoid a military metaphor, but part of your kind of toolkit that you can bring to bear to change corporate behaviour? And how important is this going to be? Is this something where you'd say, in 10 years' time, Forrest and Bird kind of really has this integrated into what you do in order to achieve change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a couple of starting points here. And one is our own ethical stance, as a citizen of the community, and those are some of the reasons that we've changed some of the way that where we have funds to invest. We choose the most ethical investment manager that we possibly can, and we've recently done so. But also from the point of view of trying to change the forces that impact on the environment. Changing corporate behaviour is absolutely where the game is at. That this is what will actually restore the New Zealand environment. And so we tend to work with kind of a bunch of tools. I typically think about an industry in terms of a bell-shaped curve of some players in the industry at the kind of the leading edge, doing really good stuff, maybe not perfect stuff, but actually really, really worthwhile. There's another end where players in the industry are doing really bad stuff and don't care and aren't going to change unless they're forced to. And there's a bunch of businesses in the middle. And so normally when we come to an industry like farming, we're wanting to try to create incentives to encourage the great end, use just transition mechanisms to move the bulk of people, and have a really strong regulatory framework to deal with the laggards. And investment is such a powerful tool, to use your metaphor, Barry, for shifting that whole curve. that we're absolutely going to be in this space more and more. And while we're looking at other economic tools like taxation, for example, as a way of shifting it, actually where capital lies is clearly part of that. And I look at 350.org, right now has a campaign around getting ACC, an instrument of the state, to actually shift its investments away from fossil fuels. And certainly the behaviour of the super fund and ACC are like easy targets for investment. But actually what we've discovered, and I think what John's been talking about as well, is that there is already a huge appetite from investors, and it will only grow to see their money and their leverage being used for good. So we're going to be trying to harness that.
Cool. So a question came in on from Facebook, and it's particularly about the banking sector, Kevin, and may relate to your discussion around banking practices. And I know 350.org was involved in some of the work around banking. Actually, I'm a trustee of theirs, so I know a bit about that stuff. But the question is,
inadvertent promotion, Barry.
Yeah. Always prepared to promote good allies like 350. But the question is, so what role do New Zealand banks have in perpetrating kind of environmentally destructive practices? So you focus primarily on fossil fuel on fossil fuel lending. Were there other things you looked at as well?
That was the principal screen that we used, and that was the analysis was actually done before I came to Forest and Bird 4 years ago, and so that fossil fuels was our particular focus. But actually, if we were doing the same exercise again now, we would extend that. We would look at, for example, investment in farming practice. We know that very many farmers want to be moving towards regenerative agriculture or to much better practices. But one of the obstacles that they face is that their bank requires them to actually farm in status quo methods. So the banks and some others, insurance companies, for example, are significant barriers to positive change in an industry that's one of the greatest influences of the state of the New Zealand environment. Yeah. So, while our process was particularly about fossil fuels, if we did it again, we would be looking at other practices too. But what I think you'll find is that a bank that takes climate change and fossil fuels seriously is going to be much more inclined to also be thinking in positive ways about other environmental factors too.
Yeah. So once we've cleaned up the investment sector, we thought we might get involved in banking as well, Kevin. So
excellent.
Yeah. So we've probably got time for one more question, and we've got one through, which is a pretty good closing question. Is John, what do you see? And this question for both of you: what do you see as some of the kind of testing grounds for this investment and environmental nexus? If we see fossil fuels being one of the issues now, we've seen some stuff around mining. There's questions around lithium for use in EV batteries and the environmental harm that can cause. Where do you see the kind of flashpoints coming in, and what kind of issues are you, what issues are keeping you awake at night? John?
Well, what keeps me awake at night is climate change and worrying about where we're heading with that. But so what is the flashpoint? I think climate change increasingly and carbon reduction increasingly is going to be important in New Zealand. We're certainly seeing it offshore, but in New Zealand, globally, you're talking about mining practices and resource supply chain, absolutely, supply chain integrity, and how you're managing your resource, how you're managing your waste. I would say that there's a huge range of areas. In New Zealand, we tend to pick on singular issues quite often, which around the environment, which might be whaling, it might be palm oil, but I think we're going to broaden it and just think more generally about climate change and supply chains as broader issues rather than just very narrow issues. But look, it's absolutely going to be driven firstly by investors and consumers who want change, and secondly by companies that realise the brand damage that can come about from getting this wrong. So they're absolutely, whether they believe in climate change or not, we're talking about banks, they are going to be forced to stress test for climate change scenarios, insurance companies. So it is reality. And, increasingly that we're going to see a lot more of regulatory and consumer push towards companies, but also companies change because they realise they need to.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree with John. Climate change clearly is the flashpoint, but I think there are other areas, and so I mentioned agricultural practice, and that's absolutely one of them. And one perhaps we haven't mentioned tonight is fishing, commercial fishing, where I think sectors where there is that spread of practice amongst the companies are particularly ripe for this type of approach. If you think about mining, all of the companies are pretty much clustered around the bad end of the spectrum. There aren't great mining companies, but with agriculture, with fishing, there is a range, and so actually shifting investment towards companies that actually show better practices has really great potential to shift the norms of a whole industry, and that's the kind of disproportionate effect that an investment approach can have in the right sector.
Cool. Well, thanks very much to you both. Thanks to people who sent in questions, and to the audience, and those of you who are watching it afterwards. Huge thanks to Kevin for joining us. Great to see you again, Kevin. Thank you so much. And to welcome back John Berry from Pathfinder. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Barry.
So this seminar and the others will be available on our website. And next week we're continuing the series. We've got I've got a seminar, interestingly enough, turning this issue of engagement with corporates around, so that we're actually looking at corporate conversations involving Kathmandu, and they're coming on to their CEOs coming onto the program to talk about how it looks from Kathmandu's side to have investment engagement, and harbour asset management is the other side of the conversation. So I'm looking forward to that. That's a slightly different cut on the issues, but it will, I think, be a really nice insight into this. Again, thank you both very much, and thanks to everyone. Hope to see you next week, 7 o'clock on Wednesday. Ka kite ana.
Ka kite.